Hello, humans. This set of cases is a little different. It's not necessarily really a set of cases, but it's accounts or narratives of doctors or healing or medicine during war, what happened to doctors during war, or what happened with refugees or epidemics. So it's kind of like, big emergencies, not for an individual, but, for the people in a whole region, something like that. Anyway, doctors are really brave. They go in where everybody else is afraid and running in the opposite direction. They help people wounded in battle. They treat epidemics, in the past and in the present. Think of how brave the doctors were during the AIDS epidemic when very little was known about it, or at the beginning of COVID when, so many people were dying and the doctors went in and many of them did die. So anyway, I'm going through in chronological order, and the earliest account that I am using is Zhang Zhongjing's preface to Shanghan Zabing Lun, which is at the end of the Han Dynasty, which ended around 220 CE. So this is pretty early. You probably know, maybe you don't know, that originally there was one book, Shanghan Zabing Lun, and then it was divided into Shanghan Lun about epidemic diseases when cold invades, and also then it was divided into Jingui Yaowei for miscellaneous diseases. So this is when he wrote it, it was one longer book, and then it was divided into these two sections. I'm not so good at Han Dynasty Chinese language, so I use the translation from Craig Mitchell, Feng Ye, and Nigel Weissman. And so this is not my translation, but here we go. He says, Zhang Zhongjing says, my family was formerly large, once counting over 200 members. I can't imagine, but they really had extended families and they had lots of kids, but that's really huge. And I think that's not the hugest Chinese clan or, big family. Anyway, from the beginning of the Jian'an reign, which the, you know, rulers would take on names of different time periods. And this is actually the last time period because the Han Dynasty ended in 220. So, this was a time period from 196 to 220 CE. And so, it's at the very end of the Han Dynasty. And when a dynasty is ending, everything's falling apart and they're people fighting and their warlords and their, armies popping up, and then there are refugees who are starving and carrying disease with them because they don't have adequate food, so they're not healthy, and crops are burnt because they don't want whoever's fighting going through a land doesn't want the enemy to get the crops, and just chaos and everything's falling apart. So he had over 200 family members, but from, 196, the beginning of the Jian'an reign, then in less than 10 years, 2/3 of his family had died. 7/10 of them from Shanghan, from cold damage, because this is Shanghan Lun. And so why was there so much Shanghan? Why were there epidemics going through? Because whenever there's war, disease just runs rampant. And so he lost so many people in his extended family in a short period of time due to wind and cold invasion, because they probably weren't well nourished, and the chaos and the anxiety. He goes on to say, lamenting the fall of our glorious past and the untimely loss of so many lives that could not be saved. I'm inspired by this to not let this happen again. And so I have diligently sought the guidance of the ancients, widely collecting various remedies, and I consulted a whole bunch of books. He's telling you like where he got his information from. So it includes Su Wen, Zhou Juan, which is usually I think refers to Ling Shu, the Nanjing, the classic of difficult issues, something called the Yin Yang Da Lun, which may or may not be part of Neijing, something else called the Tai Lu Yao Lu, the Tai Lu records of herbs. Um, and another book, Ping Mai Bianzhang, the assessment of pulses and identification of patterns. So he's giving you his credentials. He's saying where he got all this stuff and why he thinks he can write a book about it. And so he went through all of these and he created Shanghan Sabing Wen, a total of 16 volumes. They use the word fascicle. I prefer the word volume, whatever. So he wrote the book based on these, earlier records, some of which we know what they are, and some of which may be lost or we don't know what they are anymore. Anyway, he says, although this book cannot completely cure all diseases, it provides the means to understand the origin of diseases encountered. If the reader follows the material in this book, he should be able to figure out over half of the medical problems. I find it interesting, everybody else, later Jingfang doctors who really focus on Shanghan Wen, they basically say that Zhang Zhongjing covered everything and that there's, his formulas can treat anything and everything, but he says only half. Anyway, so we can see how this great loss of people due to epidemic that is the side effect of war and warfare, how that inspired him as a doctor to try and prevent this kind of devastating loss from happening again. And therefore, we've got Shanghan Lun and Jingui Yahweh. The next, in terms of time, is smallpox. And people say that Ge Hong's Zhouhu Beiji Fang is the first book that accurately describes smallpox. So at some point, I went and looked for this passage on smallpox, but the timing isn't right because Ge Hong's dates come before some of the events that are mentioned here. So, the old books, what happens is, somebody writes a book and then the later editor adds some stuff. Maybe it's added like as a annotation, but then when it's copied again later, the annotation gets incorporated into the main text. Anyway, so there's some chaos, some confusion about what happened when, but this is still in Zhouhu Fang, which is usually translated as emergency prescriptions to keep up your sleeve. And Ge Hong is this famous doctor. I forget his dates, but it's like 300 or 350. It's really early. And by the way, his wife was Lady Bao, who's another interesting character. But anyway, let's go back to smallpox. In past years, a disease was going around. Again and again, sores erupt on the head, the face, and body. They are soon seen all over the body, appearing like fire sores. So they're very red and hot looking. All the sores are capped with a milky fluid. Smallpox, chickenpox, herpes viruses, and so forth have little water blisters, but apparently it's a little milky looking for smallpox. More are engendered after they burst. If they're not quickly treated, many who have serious disease will die. After someone has been treated and recovered, the sores leave purple-black scars, which decrease over the years. This is malign toxic qi. So this is my translation, but I want to thank Alan Tsar, who, gave me some clues about translating it. And so, yeah, this sounds like this really could be smallpox. It leaves pock marks that probably are a darker color at first, and then over the years, they lighten up, but they still leave pock marks. And it's a toxic chi because so many people die from smallpox. I forget, it's something like 50% of the people who get smallpox die from it, and those who don't die are left with pock marks all over their face and other parts of their body. It's a pretty horrible disease. We're pretty lucky that it's been eliminated. Mm. The text goes on to say, everyone says during the fourth year of Yonghui, which is, something to do with who was ruling at the time, that happens to be 653, which is well after this book was written. So you can see that Ge couldn't have written this part long time after he died. Okay, so during, a certain year, 653, these sores flowed from west to east, spreading everywhere between the four seas. So, this is saying there was an epidemic that came from the west, which the west back then would be places like Persia and all the countries that have Stan at their name, like Pakistan and Tajikistan and all of those kind of countries coming through the Silk Roads and so forth. Um, so people ate boiled quetzai, which is some Chinese plant that, a green vegetable kind of leafy thing. And they cooked it. It's not spinach, but something like that you could imagine with finely chopped garlic. And then that was able to stop the smallpox. After initial onset, the patient needs to eat it quickly. You can't wait till you've had it for a few days. You see smallpox coming, start eating this. And they should eat less rice and other dishes and more of this vegetable. It goes on during the Zhenwu period in Nanyang. So this should be, this could be around Ge time, the 4th century CE. The problem is there's a number of periods that are called the Zhenwu period in different ruling, but rule during different dynasties. And so we don't know for sure, but that's the one that seems to be within Ge time, but it could be a later thing, just like we saw the previous one. Anyway, during this time, this disease was obtained by contact with barbarian captives. So it was called captive sores. So the word they're using for barbarian captives is this word, lu. And yeah, this word. Which, they're different words that can mean captive, but when there would be a battle, then they might take captives of the other army, but some of the captives had these, had smallpox or whatever. So, the Chinese got it from capturing barbarians, from the West, and then they called it captive sores for a while. So, okay, it must have been a terror when smallpox was going through, especially the first time. Anyway, so you can see these aren't cases, but I find it interesting. Of course, then we can see the diseases, spread of diseases related to war and fighting and captives and so forth. The third of these four things is there's a book that's called Sebastian on Shu, which is UB43. And the author is somebody named Zhuang Chuo. And he was a Song dynasty, kind of end of Song dynasty, or well, no. Anyway, we'll see. And he wrote in his postscript what happened to him, and why he wrote a whole book about how to locate UB43 and how to do moxa on UB43. So why was he so inspired to write about this one point? He says, I'm from Xuchang, which is a city in Henan, and I suffered the disaster of the Jin barbarians. So when the Northern Song dynasty ended, the Jin dynasty began in the north, and anyone who could fled to the south. And then there was the Southern Song dynasty. So after that, in China, the Jin were in the north and the Southern Song were in the south. And so this disaster of the Jin barbarians is when the Jin, which were a nomadic group of people from the north, swept in and took over the capital and you know, just took charge of that whole area. Okay, so I suffered the disaster of the Jin barbarians, the worry and danger. I was exposed to the cold of winter and the heat of summer while descending into the east. You know, you're going towards the ocean, so it's downhill. Maybe that's why he has descending. Anyway, so like he couldn't travel in luxury, even though he was obviously a literate person who probably was well off enough. But now it's just chaos and refugees fleeing from, the disaster of being invaded. So he was exposed to all kinds of weather chi that he wasn't used to. I arrived in a place called Subin on a certain day of the 8th month. So this is probably July of 1127 because this event happened in 1127 and he's fleeing. But maybe it was 1128 because if it took him a really long time to get through. Oh, look, I wrote 1928. That should be 1128. Anyway, so he arrived in, some place in 1127 and contracted malaria when he reached Jiangsu province, which was in the south. So now he's in the southern Song. He's like safe. He's away from the Jin barbarians, or at least he's as safe as anyone is. Um, I was improperly treated by a doctor, so my yin declined and my wei was consumed. Of course, yin qi is the qi that flows in the channels and with blood in the blood vessels, and wei qi is the part that goes under the skin and opens and closes the pores and so far, so forth. So his yin and wei were extremely deficient after fleeing and after being exposed to all kinds of weather chi and after being improperly treated by a doctor. At the end of spring of the following year, sorry, and this should say 1128, I still suffered swelling on the dorsum of my feet, abdominal distension, rapid breathing, inability to eat, diarrhea, heavy body, atrophy of the legs, and I needed a cane to get up. You can see he's really a mess. His health is, just devastated. So I found a doctor, a person named Chen Lao Wang. He was a specialist in applying moxa to UB43. It sounds like this may be like a folk doctor or something like that, he specializes in this one thing. But from for a period of 7 days, he received 300 cones of moxa on UB43. So you can see that this doesn't mean he received 300 cones in one day. He received them over a period of 7 days. So if you go 7 into 300, that's like 40 some each day, 40 some cones each day. On the second day of Moxa, his breath was already peaceful in his chest. The swelling and distension had both decreased. The diarrhea stopped. This is just in the second day. Wow. And I could eat again. By the 8th day, I was ready to go out in a sedan chair or a palanquin, the kind of thing where people put up on their shoulders and carry him. He needed a cane before and he could hardly get around, but now he still may need a sedan chair, but he's out of bed. And so he could go out to pay his respects to his superior. He had some job and he finally got to where his boss was. After making my report to him, I received an additional 100 cones of moxa, and from then on, the condition gradually decreased until I was in good health. So he's had now 400 cones of moxa in a relatively short period of time on this point. at that time, relatives and old friends saw that this treatment had outstanding merits. So several people received moxa and their lodged disease, meaning chronic disease that was hard to get rid of, it was lodged in their body. So their chronic diseases were removed from all of them. Okay, so that's his account. Can you imagine fleeing the barbarians and being exposed to weather, all kinds of weather and getting sick and being starved? Oh, it just sounds like such a horror. But he got through, and again, he was inspired to share what worked for him in order to, save other people from a similar fate. The last one that I want to talk about is Li Dongyuan, who was one of the four great masters of the Jin Yuan dynasties. You can see his date, and he was at the end of the Jin dynasty and the beginning of the Yuan dynasty. So the previous guy, Zhuang, was at the Song Jin transition. Now that he's like 100 years later at the Jin Yuan transition. And he's the founder of the Nourish Earth School. He's the person who first wrote Buzhong Tang and a bunch of other formulas. He's very famous, well-respected doctor who really felt the spleen and stomach were the most important thing. So he wrote a book called Pi Wei Lun. But before he wrote that book, he wrote this other book, the Nei Wai Shang Bian Huo Lun. Sorry, I can read some Chinese, but I can't speak Chinese. So this book is he felt that everybody was thinking everything was Shanghan or cold damage. So everybody was thinking problems were from external attack and that they weren't understanding internal causes of disease, or in disease that comes from the interior. So, he thought they weren't paying enough attention to food, diseases caused by food, or emotions. It's not that he thought external evils weren't important. It's just he thought everybody's talking about that and nobody's talking about this. So I'm going to talk about this. And so he wrote a book about what's the difference between these two? How do we tell which is which? And it has all kinds of formulas and information in it. And so in this book, he wrote an account of the siege of Kaifeng, which was the capital at the time when the Yuan, the Mongols, overtook Kaifeng. And so the capital, it was called Bianjing at the time. Cities often change names when there's a new emperor or something like that. And so the Mongols put the city under siege, which means that they camped out around the city, and they didn't allow any food to come in, and they didn't allow any waste or dead bodies to come out, and farmers couldn't go out to the fields to grow things. And so eventually you're going to starve people out, or epidemics will sweep through, and eventually the people will open up the gates and let them in. So when you have a siege like this, it takes longer, but there's less loss of life for the army that's doing the siege, less work. And so again, here this introduction. Well, I don't know if it's the introduction, I don't remember where it is, but here's this passage from it where he wrote an account of the siege of Kaifeng when the Mongols overthrew it. And this is translated by somebody named Robert Himes. This again is not translated by me. And so in the past, at the change of eras, which means when the Jin became Yuan in a certain year, which was 1232, the capital was at maximum readiness up to the last 10 days of the third month. It was ready for the attack of the Mongols. In all, it had suffered the enemy's attack for half a month. And after the siege was lifted, because the city surrendered, barely 1 or 2 out of every 10,000 people in the capital did not get sick. It's like, 99 point whatever percent of the people got sick. And the sick who died followed one another without an end. There was just so much death from whatever this disease and starvation that was going through. Apparently, Beijing had 12 gates, and at each of the capital's 12 gates, the dead were sent out every day. There were at least 2,000 at most, and no less than 1,000 at the fewest. And this was so for almost 2 months. Um, so this, wow, so many people dying after this siege. And there he is. He was like from a rich, wealthy family, and he studied medicine because his mother died and the doctors hadn't been able to help her. So, kind of in an act of filial piety, he studied medicine, but he wasn't like acting as a doctor. He wasn't just generally treating patients. He might prescribe something for his friends, but he was really knowledgeable about medicine. Later, after this, he started practicing regularly because I probably lost everything, needed a job after this. So that's like the story of, how sick people were, and what can you do? There's not enough food. You've run out of medicine by then. You just have to watch everybody getting sick and dying. And so afterwards, when the Mongols took over, then they took people captive. And of course, they raped the women or took them back to wherever they were. They, killed whatever resistance there was, the people who were still resisting, and they took people captive. They looted, the riches that any rich, in this situation, you could have lots of gold, but what good does gold do if there's nothing to buy? So Li Dongyuan was friends with a poet who's pretty well known in China. He's not the most well known, but he's pretty well known, Yuan Hao Wen, and you can see his dates. And so they were friends, and they were held captive after the siege and were on a forced march to Shandong. And you can see here's a map to see how far it is. And it's like 360 kilometers, which, I'm American. I don't really know how far that is in miles, but like a forced march all this way after starving for months and maybe being sick. So during the march, Yuan was still writing poetry. And so this is my poor translation of this poem. White bones strewn about everywhere in the brush. The mulberry and catalpa have become a dragon's desert over the years. Only the dead grow north of the river, but scattered smoke from broken houses reveals a few homes. So as he's marching, he's seeing all these dead bodies and bones, and the trees have been burnt and killed and dried out, and all he's seeing is dead. But when he sees smoke coming from a few houses, it seems like somebody's hiding, maybe in the broken down houses, cooking, and so life goes on. But just the horror of this. Can you imagine? Just the horror. So doctors are really brave. And sometimes they're forced to be brave. Doctors see horrible things and report them. And so this is, one of the reasons that we honor our past medical ancestors. Well, whatever. I'm done for today.